I often have to explain to people when they're driving by Co-op City what it is. And I just say it's the world's largest housing cooperative, and it's affordable, and it's great, and I'm sorry you don't live here.
Co-op City is the largest affordable housing development in the United States and the largest cooperative complex in the world. With 15,000 apartments and 55,000 residents, it's more than just a housing project. It's a city in a city.
Just name a service, we probably have it. Whether it's our own police force, senior programs, programs for youth, just about every denomination. Churches are here, there's stores. If you don't want to leave Co-op City, you don't have to.
Countless commuters drive past Co-op City every day. Many look at its stark buildings and remote location and assume it's public housing for the poor. In fact, it is a private cooperative for the middle class.
The main misconception of Co-op City is that it's the projects. Because the buildings look similar, except for a couple of red buildings that sprinkle throughout. And I don't blame them, because that's what they know from other places within New York City. And if you don't know the structure or the foundation of what Co-op City is, then it's very easy to have that misconception.
Co-op City is a limited equity cooperative owned and governed by its residents. Unlike other forms of private housing, however, cooperators gain no profit from the sale of their homes, guaranteeing long-term affordability.
In a rental, there's a landlord who collects some kind of profit. He doesn't invest in housing complex without a return on it. There's no profit here. Any income goes into our general fund, and if we have extra cash, it's there. It's ours. It belongs to all of us.
Welcome to the show, the Gilchrist Experience. We're going to talk about affordable housing. And as you see, Co-op City is one of the most affordable housing that we have in the city. And it was built by labor leaders thinking about what's most beneficial for their workers and the middle class. And in today's environment where we have gentrification throughout Harlem and throughout the city, everywhere you go, there's the rich moving in and the poor moving out.
And the middle class.
Especially in the White House, as we all see. So we're here to make an appeal to our new president for more affordable housing. Since, Adam, you made this piece, so tell us a little bit of your take on what's happening today
of course.
in affordable housing.
Well, first, let me just explain quickly why I decided to make this film. Which is that I think there's a real misunderstanding about the role that affordable housing plays within cities.
Right.
Who lives there, why it's important to support people there, and what it's like to live in affordable housing as well. And, you know, many people see Co-op City from the highway, you know, driving in and out of the city. Almost everyone who's been to New York City has seen it. But really, apart from the people who live there, I think many people see those kind of grim-looking buildings and assume probably it's pretty grim to live there. But then you go inside Co-op City and there's an enormous amount of open space. In fact, on the other side, there's the Hutchinson River. And more than that, it is extraordinarily affordable. And it's a very unusual, I think, form of home ownership, unfortunately unusual, which is called a limited equity cooperative, or an affordable cooperative, which means that it is a form of home ownership in which residents have a say in the governance of their homes, in any decisions involving refinancing, in any decisions over management, but they do not gain a profit, from the appreciation of the property when they leave, which means that it is kept affordable in the future. And so I think this is a really important model of affordable housing that, as we'll watch more of the video, you'll see there's really an appeal for bringing back this form of affordable middle-income housing, very important for stabilizing the city's workforce, and unfortunately, for a variety of reasons that we can discuss, no longer supported at local, state, and federal levels of government.
Well, a lot of talk about privatization, which your organization,
Right.
Chris?
So maybe I can sort of pick up where Adam left off and,
Right.
and frame the picture about Co-op City, and Millicent, Dick, and I all live in 3 different Mitchell Lama co-ops. So Co-op
do I.
City is a Mitchell Lama co-op,
Include
and
me.
you live in a Mitchell Lama. Okay, we live in 1, 2, 3, 4 different Mitchell Lama co-ops then. And so the idea of Mitchell, just to kind of frame, so Millicent, Dick, and I are involved in an organization called Cooperators United for Mitchell Lama.
Okay.
And we have been for 10 years or more in our own individual co-ops and citywide fighting the privatization and the loss of Mitchell Lama co-op housing.
Okay.
And just to think about it a little bit, Mitchell Lama came out of the post-World War II, post-Depression, FDR time frame, war on poverty, and the whole idea back then was that government was a force for good, that there were certain
Right.
basic needs in our communities. We had the need for housing, we had the need for food, we have the need for medical care,
Okay.
we have the need for education. And these were things that the government could do to help people. Mitchell Lama grew out of that thinking and mentality, and the idea of Mitchell Lama is you pay almost nothing to buy your apartment, way, way below market rate, and when you leave with what you put into it. And the next person on the waiting list comes in. So it's for middle income people, single people making, you know, maybe $30,000 a year to families making 100 and something, you know, in the low hundreds. It's that income range. So not the really
Is that
rich.
today?
Yeah, today.
Today
It's
so
still
far?
about, you know, somebody can get into Co-op City or Cadman Towers where I live, or Esplanade Garden where
Making
you guys
$30,000 a
making
year?
$30,000 as a single person.
As a
Somewhere
single-
in that
okay.
range, and
All
then up to about 110 or so for the
For a
larger
family of-
size families. And so what happened was, now in my other life, I'm not a housing policy person, I'm a social worker. And I've been a
Okay.
social worker for more than 40 years. And I was a social worker, therefore, before Ronald Reagan. And when Ronald Reagan came in, what he basically said was government's no good, can't do anything, business does everything better. If there's not a profit motive, it's no good.
Right.
And the whole housing field, therefore, and everything else changed at that time. And we moved away from the Mitchell Lama model, which is a nonprofit model, to now what we really talk about when we talk about housing, we're not really talking about housing, we're talking about real estate. So all the housing policy people are really about real estate, it's who makes how much profit and all that kind of stuff. And really what we advocate is going back to the time when we're really just talking about housing.
Okay.
Housing low, moderate, middle income people in an affordable way. Because the housing policies today are really, instead of Mitchell Lama, which is you pay to get in, you get what you get out, nobody makes a profit, and therefore it stays affordable. What the housing policies today is that the real estate developer has to make money, but he gets a lot of tax breaks, or he gets, you know, to build in places where he wouldn't, you know, be able to build without the tax breaks. And so it's a different model and it's a different framework. And we want to go back to the nonprofit model.
Right, for my own self-interest, you know, I'm concerned about my home. And how do I prevent developers coming in and taking over this fantasy land that I live in? I mean, Esplanade Gardens is a beauty, just as beautiful as Co-op City. And it's in Manhattan. So it's in you know, your subway ride away from everything.
Right. And so what's happened in these buildings, which is why Cooperators United for Mitchell Lama got together, is that it's not an outside developer who comes in to do it. It's the inside people who are greedy, I think, and want to make a profit. They want to change the model. And instead of keeping it a nonprofit model, an affordable place to live, they want to make money. So this whole mentality that shifted, you know, sort of from housing is a place to live and real estate as an asset and a profit and a, you know, an investment. So what you can do is what we all did in our developments is fight against the people that are trying to privatize it and make it from a nonprofit to a for-profit. Yeah.
You have what to add, Colby?
I was going to echo I will echo what Chris said. No outside developer can come in and take over a Mitchell-Lama co-op.
Okay.
It can't be taken away from you, but you can give it up.
You can lose it.
You can lose it if 2/3 of the shareholders vote to go private. I'd like to also
2/3.
2/3. I'd like to also echo some of the points that Chris made. Way back in the beginning, the Mitchell-Lama law was passed in 1955. It was one of a series of laws, limited dividend housing law, et cetera. Well, not too much ancient history, but the inspiration behind the Mitchell-Lama law was actually the United Housing Federation, and which was a group of unions that came together.
Yeah, right.
First,
Yeah.
the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, and
okay.
a very remarkable man named Abraham Kazin, who developed credit unions for his workers, and then started to develop housing. And one of the very first limited equity co-ops in the city of New York was Amalgamated Housing up in the Bronx. Up in the Bronx. And so in an incredible alliance, I mean, the times were right. Unions were actually powerful. They were a force in New York City and state politics. Federal money was available for land acquisition, Title I. An unbelievable alliance between Abraham Kazin and Robert Moses existed, and somehow,
We're talking about the 50s.
Yeah.
Right?
in 1955, got the Mitchell-Lama law through the state legislature. And the inspiration was the co-ops that the unions had built previously. How can the state of New York get involved to bring this wonderful experiment that had already produced amalgamated housing and some of the Seward Park housing on the Lower East Side? How can we make it bigger?
For working people.
For working people. And so this was considered, Abraham Kazin was very clear. He wanted to build the cooperative commonwealth. This was a permanent form of land tenure. In the original 1955 legislation, there was no buyout provision. It was supposed to go on like this forever.
Well, that's
That
2
last-
centuries ago.
That's 19.
And most people mind.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
1955, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
But the law was amended 2 years later to incentivize
Rentals.
private developers to come in and put their own money into Mitchell-Lama projects and build rentals. We are
just to-
convinced
let me
that,
just clarify that.
Let me
because-
just
yeah,
bring it.
I'm sorry.
You're going from one Republican that started it and to the next, Eisenhower to Reagan. As you bring in Reagan, the decade of greed, and everything changed. So this socialism that you would call that back in '55.
Let me jump
I
in.
was
actually.
going to
So-
say not socialism,
Yeah.
but
Well,
let Adam
first
take
of
it.
all, Eisenhower wasn't actually involved in the original legislation. It was
Well, he
a
was
state.
president.
It was a
It was a
state.
state and local program.
Okay, but I'm saying he was president.
He was president. He was
Okay.
president. But in fact, the Mitchell-Lama program was a response to what New York State saw as a lack of action from the federal government on middle-income housing
okay.
in New York
That's
City.
interesting.
Okay, so there's a federal agency called the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which in the 50s played a big role in subsidizing suburban housing, and often this suburban housing was segregated. And the FHA also played a role in stimulating some rental housing in the city and some cooperative housing, but it didn't last long. And so as this kind of cooperative and rental housing that was stimulated by the federal government kind of ran out of steam, New York State and New York City and a lot of these union leaders started to think, how can we pick up the slack here? And they looked at the limited equity model, as well as actually life insurance housing developments like Stuyvesant Town famously, and said, okay, here are models that work for building middle-income housing. How can we expand this? And most importantly, how can the public sector get involved in lending money to these developments so that they have debt to build these projects.
Well,
So
we might mention Harlem, which the most affordable housing in Harlem is Esplanade Gardens, which is a Mitchell-Lama house.
Esplanade, Riverton are two in Harlem.
Riverton is a life insurance development.
Right.
Yeah, built by
Riverton is
MetLife.
life insurance, and
Right.
River Bend is the other
Mitchell-Lama.
in Harlem.
And just to clarify too, the original Mitchell-Lama law in 1955 provided for Mitchell-Lama co-ops, which were nonprofit co-ops, limited equity, and Mitchell-Lama rentals. And the Mitchell-Lama rentals were limited profit. So the developer could make money off of them, but only a smaller 6%.
6% was the return.
Right.
If you got your 6%,
then
you
you-
were done.
right.
If you didn't get your 6%, you could apply for a rent increase. And before you lose the moment, the inspiration for Mitchell-Lama was the cooperative model, the limited equity cooperative model. It was very local. The people who actually drafted the law worked for Mayor Robert Wagner, who was, and they took it, they sold it to Albany. But it came from New York City. And the first 74 Mitchell-Lamas that were built were co-ops, all of them, almost 12,000 apartments from the first 7 years of the program, from about 1955 to 62, all co-ops. Matter of fact, the first Mitchell-Lama in the city of New York was built by the United Housing Federation right next to the amalgamated co-ops. It's called Park Reservoir, and that's Mitchell-Lama number 1.
Where was that? Where was that?
In the Bronx.
Also
In the Bronx.
Bronx again. Okay.
near Van Cortlandt Park.
Where a lot of other
So
limited equity
what was
co-ops
the
are.
last Mitchell-Lama housing built?
The last one, there's a bit of disagreement about this, but I think it's Winthrop Gardens, which is also in the Bronx. But maybe let me give a bit of...
Co-op City was one of the last.
It was
Now,
the
why did they
later-
stop?
Well,
Why
yeah.
did they
In
stop?
fact, it continued until the late 70s.
Why did they stop?
Why did they stop? 2 reasons, I would say. One was inflation. There was heavy inflation happening over the course of the 1970s, which drove the cost of building new housing out of sync with the wages of the residents. And the second issue was that the federal government under Ronald Reagan, in fact, under Richard Nixon, cut federal subsidies. There was a program called Section 236, which the city and state were using to supplement their own subsidy programs to bring down the cost of the housing because of inflation. And in 1973, President Nixon imposed the moratorium that ended all supply-side housing subsidies for a period of time. And those subsidies were stopped, and the Mitchell-Lama program essentially was no longer feasible because of the high costs of construction. But I just wanted to also give some numbers to give some context to the Mitchell-Lama program so we can understand the context of co-ops within the context of the program as a whole. I mean, I think tonight we'll be talking predominantly about the cooperatives, but the cooperatives are only about half of the program in general. And I think when we look at some of these trends in the numbers, you can actually see some of the story coming out in terms of what strategies might be for preservation. So there are about 269 Mitchell-Lama developments in New York City, 140,000 apartments. That is a huge amount, originally constructed. That is over 3/4 the amount of public housing in the city, which is a phenomenal public investment in affordable housing in the city.
Now, private developers are just looking at that, and the tongues are wagging, looking to grab all this housing, right?
So about half of that housing was
They don't-
initially built by private for-profit
I mean,
developers.
knowing
as
all the
rentals.
figures is great, but how do we save this great idea? That's what I'm really interested in.
I mean, one of the things that happened is that a lot of the Mitchell-Lama rentals have gone out of the program.
They're gone.
Okay.
They left when
rentals
they
are gone.
could because but the co-ops have not gone out in great numbers. That we have lost some, but we have not
Well, you're
lost.
talking Mitchell-Lama housing rentals.
Right.
Approximately
Gone.
90% of the Mitchell-Lama developments that have privatized have been rentals.
Ah,
So the co-ops have
okay.
not.
Yeah,
left.
we really need to emphasize this point,
talking about
Winston,
co-ops.
Right.
because when you read something in the papers, they'll
Right.
tell you the Mitchell-Lamas
They're dead.
are,
Not
are
dead.
dying. They're not dead.
Right.
Let's go back to Adam's number. 140,000 apartments in the 5 boroughs. About half were co-ops and about half were rentals. Actually, slightly more were co-ops. Of the rentals, more than half are gone.
About 2/3,
Of
40,000
the rentals.
of the 60,000.
40,000 of the 60 are gone. Of the co-ops, less than 4,000 are gone, about 6%. And so to get back to your question, how do you preserve Mitchell-Lama housing?
We ban the privatization.
Ban the privatization of Mitchell-Lama
If there was
co-ops.
a political will, we have written and we have brought legislation and we have gotten some sponsors to say there is no reason why someone who's received government subsidies for as long as they lived in their Mitchell-Lama co-op, that they should leave with a profit and pull the ladder up behind them. None, period, the end. It does not make any sense politically, but every politician says, oh, I'm for affordable housing, I'm for affordable, but they will not pass this legislation in Albany. It needs to be brought to task. The legislation is simply you cannot go private if you live in a Mitchell-Lama co-op until you no longer get the government subsidies that make your housing affordable. And the government subsidies that make Mitchell-Lama co-op affordable is we don't pay regular real estate taxes. So a regular building pays regular real estate taxes. We pay about 1/10 of regular real estate taxes. We also have many of the Mitchell-Lama co-ops have phenomenal mortgage deals. They have housing loan, capital loan programs that are not available to other regular market rate co-ops. So our affordability is that we get tax subsidies, and we should not, nobody should get a profit after being subsidized, you know, and then not having affordable housing anymore. So it's very simple. The law can be passed that says you cannot go private. And it should be passed, and we've been trying, Cooperators United have been trying to get traction on this law, and we haven't over the years.
I think there's another component in this, that when you look at those of us who have lived in Mitchell-Lama housing, as in the case of Central Harlem, if you consider privatization, not a bad idea maybe, but if you have a development that is in disarray and needs major capital improvement work done, then all of the monies from these sales may end up going into the repairs of the buildings, which means you may not really see a profit in the long run.
Well, you know, Millie, you bring up a good point, because one of the issues that Mitchell-Lama co-ops are facing is that they're aging.
Right.
And again, Reagan onward, what's happened in public housing for poor people and in other places is a disinvestment of government. You have to maintain the building. You have, if you have affordable housing, you can't let it fall apart around you. You have to be able to have a way to maintain it. And if it's moderate income people and not really wealthy people, the continued government support to maintain the housing is needed.
In the case of Esplanade, where I live, when most of us came in, we were working residents. We worked for Harlem Hospital, Verizon, the Department of Education. 60% of those people still remain, and
well, you don't move out of Mitchell-Lama's. You die.
yes,
and nobody can take over your apartment,
Absolutely.
and that's the way there's turnover in Mitchell-Lama's.
But the issue is
Nobody
that
moves
many
out.
of them are still alive and are on
Senior
fixed,
citizens.
and it's senior.
Right.
60%
Including
of
myself.
our population is senior citizens, and that means they're on fixed incomes, and they really cannot afford an increase. But at the same time, you see where the improvements to the property are not necessarily happening. So the monies don't always give the impression of reinvesting it into the apartments and things.
And unfortunately, the privatizers, we call them privateers because it sort of gives a pirate kind of sense. But the privatizers or the privateers will say, well, rich people can move in, we could go private, everybody will get rich, no one will get hurt, and the rich people will pay for all our repairs. And that's not the way to go. The way to go is to figure out a way, and there have been ways, like there's something called the double equity program, where the incoming people pay more now to purchase, but it's still a fabulous deal for them, and that more goes, you know, because the way it normally works is if I move out of my Mitchell Lama, or when I die, and you know, and then my Mitchell Lama is sold, then the next person on the waiting list pays my estate the money for the apartment, and I take it with me, and the money, you know, stays there. So what happened now in many of the Mitchell Lamas is the new person coming in is paying off my estate, and then they're also paying the building money for repairs. But when they leave, they get that money that they paid in for repairs plus the money they paid for the apartment back, and the next person gives that back to them. And so that's how it's nonprofit. Does that make sense?
What do we do about mismanagement?
Well, before we go there, I don't know if your viewers have enough patience for this, but I've been the president of Village East Towers, where I live, for about the last 10 years.
And where's that?
It's on the Lower East Side.
Village.
It's on Avenue C between 10th and 11th. We are 3 high-rises, a row of townhouses, 434 households.
You haven't been privatized in that neighborhood?
No, because he's
all around. Well,
and,
you know,
and it will never happen. But I don't know which question to answer first. We had capital needs, like everybody else. We had a major problem in that our lovely terraces were crumbling. And then we had a local Law 11 inspection, and we found out that there was indeed a construction deficiency in our buildings. The entire facade did not have expansion joints in the brick work. As a result, when it expanded over the years in the summer, it expanded upward and cracked the entire roof slab around the entire perimeter. We had multi-million dollars worth of capital repairs, and so it's the roof. It's the facade, it was the terraces, it was new windows, new doors, and we, I think, very creatively found ways to finance this.
With the population that's also aging, and
same
also
as yours. Senior citizens, very
nobody
diverse.
moves out.
But it was great. So what's available? The New York City has the Housing Development Corporation. We refinanced our mortgage with the Housing Development Corporation. We ended up with a long-term 30-year mortgage with a blended interest rate that was less than 3%, very affordable. We applied to the 8A program. We rebuilt our entire garage, which was also crumbling. And then while we were at it, we installed highly efficient electricity-saving lighting. Right now, if you walk into our garage, the only lights will be on the driveway. The light over your car doesn't turn on until you actually are 10 feet away from your car. And the hallway lights are the same way. They're dim until you walk out into the hall, and they go bright.
I guess the point is, like, where there's a will, there's a way to maintain the affordability.
So I will cut the detail, but we used HDC, we used 8A, we survived the New York State Energy Research Development Agency's multifamily performance program, 434. And so
including my son and my grandchildren.
And 434 Winston, and we have met all of our capital needs, very favorably financed. We did double equity. So I will give you a concrete example.
What year was this?
1968 is our cornerstone.
Okay.
And the refinancing?
And the refinancing has been going on since 2004.
Yeah.
All right, 2004.
But I just want to explain what this breaks down to into real dollar figures. We're not paying any more than you guys are paying or you guys are paying. We did
for a 2-bedroom apartment?
I live in a 2-bedroom apartment, about $750 a month.
on C today?
On Avenue C. And if you move out of that two-apartment, if you moved out of that two-bedroom apartment today, somebody else could buy it for around $30,000.
That's in that neighborhood. That's amazing. Okay.
Okay, Winston. It's because the neighborhood doesn't matter, because the market doesn't matter.
Right.
What we would love to say on television and everywhere else as loudly as we can is that the geniuses who came up with this not-for-profit model said the market is irrelevant to price.
And let me share a quote
You
here.
get back what you paid in.
Can I share a
Please
quote
do.
here from Abraham Kazin? So Abraham Kazin was the founder of this cooperative movement, who built, some of the first limited equity cooperative housing in New York City. And a fun little factoid: the only living New Yorker to have a street named after him while he was still alive. It's actually in the Lower East Side, very close to Village East. So he wanted to inform people moving into his cooperatives what a cooperative meant and how it was different from other forms of investment. Okay, so he said, we make it absolutely clear from the very beginning that the purpose of a housing cooperative is to supply shelter at the lowest possible cost. We reiterate this objective time and again. We tell those interested in joining that we will make every effort to safeguard the investment so it won't go down in quality. I am proud that not a single cooperative has ever lost a dollar he has invested in any of our cooperatives. On the other hand, no one has made a profit on his investment either. Basically, cooperatives are not profit-making ventures. They seek to render a service at most. And here's the important part, though he's not totally against the capitalist system. He's saying those who seek profits have ample opportunities to invest their funds in other types of real estate, in other investments, where they may either make large profits or lose their money. That is their business. But the business of a cooperative is to supply housing at the lowest possible price. And I think that's really a very clear summation of the difference between housing as we increasingly see it, as determined by the neighborhood, and the value goes up and down, and you're bidding other people out to try and get that hot commodity. In the views of Kazin and in the views of the founders of Mitchell Lama, initially, it
how
really
can
was
all this
about
help us uptown, where we're struggling with mismanagement and the greed of developers? I mean, we're in a position where you were a long time ago.
Well, the idea is, I think that it's important to remind your shareholders that this is a cooperative and not, it is your responsibility to become active in your homes and become involved in, you vote for your boards of directors. You should be running people for the board. You should be actively looking at your financial statements, participating in meetings. The whole idea of Mitchell Lama was based on what's called the Rochdale principles of, that were principles of cooperative businesses, and so co-ops are actually a business, and so the idea is that everybody participates and everybody is involved. And I think what happens sometimes is in these developments, people get lazy,
Well, they don't know. We need an education.
Right, they need to be educated.
Interestingly, like if we have problems, where do we go?
Right. So interestingly, one of the biggest limited equity co-ops is Penn South, right, in Chelsea.
Not a Mitchell Lama.
It's not a Mitchell Lama, but it is a limited equity co-op.
Chelsea?
Penn South is a development. I think it's
21st
like,
Street?
Yeah.
Between 23rd and 28th.
Oh,
And
that's
so
a big one.
they have,
Between 8th and 9th.
8th and
Yeah.
but they have an education staff person on their staff who educates people on the beauty of their development.
Would you say this is not Mitchell Lama?
No, it's the same idea though.
same
It's a
idea.
limited equity. So it's the same thing. You get,
And it was built by the United Housing Foundation.
Right.
So this the same group that built Co-op City later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it, but the idea is that you do need to educate people about, and one of the things that gets in the way.
And can I just say that one of the things that Cooperators United for Mitchell Lama is trying to do is educate people. About a year ago, we
How do when I'm sitting here waiting for some answers on how do I fight to save my home?
I'm going to try to give you one.
Okay.
Only a partial answer, though. So we created a speakers bureau, and we have a presentation, and it's called What's So Great About Mitchell Lama.
Okay.
And we've taken it around to community rooms around the city so that people talk about some of the things we've been talking about with you here tonight. How did we get here? What's so great about it? What's our unique history? What's our unique economic model? And how can you get involved? And so that's step one. The idea of if you find yourself living in a cooperatives that you feel to be mismanaged, that's a whole other topic, and I think Chris is beginning to address it.
Okay.
You really need to get organized. You really need to get good people elected. If you feel it's mismanaged, you need to take over the board, because the board hires the managing agent, the board hires the accountant, the board hires the attorney, the board supervises the maintenance staff. So you have the opportunity as a Mitchell Lama co-op to run the place the way you think it should be run. But sometimes it's a lot of work to capitalize on that opportunity.
Right. And one of the problems in the building is that, in a lot of the developments, is that the people that are interested in privatization, often the first step for them is to take over the board and then to try to move the place private. And so it is very important to pass the legislation that says you can't go private, because then that's off the table, and then you don't have to, you have to worry about managing your building in the best way possible.
You're saying you would need 2/3 of the cooperative.
Well, the way the law, the way the rules are written is that in order to privatize, they an affirmative 2/3 of the building has to vote on the plan that's developed. But the plans can cost anywhere from a couple $100,000 to millions of dollars to develop.
A plan.
It's called an offering plan or a black book.
Oh, I see.
So that, the building that's interested in privatization, there's rules that specify how do you go about that. And, people have to vote to authorize money for the plan development, and then, but, what happens is if your board, like my board was completely controlled by privatizers, and we still, through persistence, defeated privatization at Cadman Tower. So that, it was a more than...
How did you manage that?
Organizing. We got people together, we educated everybody, we put out newsletters, we held information forums.
Your board was infiltrated with privatizers.
Our board was 99, there was one board, maybe one board member who was not interested in privatization. All the rest were.
Out of 9.
Out of...
Do you have a 9-person board?
Yes, 9-person board.
And what did you do?
Organized.
Organized,
how?
educated. We started meetings. We developed a newsletter. We put out. We held educational forums. Dick came out in the very early days.
Chris and I met in 2004. At which point you already had a red herring.
No. We had
a feasibility study.
Yeah.
I've got my co-host on the phone. He's from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And he usually sits where you're sitting now. But since it was so crowded, he had something else to do with it. Welcome to the show, Graham. Have you listened to any of this?
Hey, how you doing?
How you doing?
Graham.
Okay. I'm going to talk fast because my phone battery is low.
Okay.
The people need to understand a couple of things. I don't know what you covered, but I was looking and reviewing the mortgage, specifically covering the property that you're in, Winston.
Right.
Now, there are a couple of things that you all need to look into, and I'm going to give you a couple of terms. Amortization. All right? Amortization is the schedule for the mortgage that's paid every month to the lender. And that's broken down into the balance on the principal that you borrowed, like 14 million, 20 million, whatever it is, the interest, taxes, and other fees. Put it together, you have the monthly mortgage. You should have an amortization schedule. This goes for any and everybody borrowing money.
Mm-hmm.
You should know what you're paying in interest every month.
Mm-hmm.
With that schedule, you should be able to, with a good mortgage, prepay the principal. Now, your mortgage is a commercial mortgage because it is a co-op, the multiple dwelling. So you should have the amortization schedule so that you can see exactly what the total expenditure is in the interest you're paying to pay off the money that you borrow. In a conventional home loan, a person can pay as much as 20 to 30% additional to the value of the property in interest. That's a lot of money. So you need to get the amortization schedule from the lender and know exactly how much money he's making on you in that transaction. If you're looking to refinance, my question would be, well, I know you have a balloon mortgage. Balloon mortgage.
You do at Esplanade?
With a balloon mortgage,
That's
when
a
you
problem.
make that monthly
Big
payment,
problem.
you should have a reserve. All co-ops should have a reserve. That is money sitting in the bank for any and every emergency, just like a savings account. Those reserves need to be present not only for the future, but for any potential person who is going to buy a co-op in your development. You should have a few $1 million in reserves looking at the size of that development. If you don't have reserves, something is wrong. All right? You must have reserves with a co-op or a condo. The whole development should have an account with reserves in it.
Okay.
When you're making your payments monthly, you should be putting money aside for that balloon payment, which is going to be required at the end of that mortgage. That balloon payment will either be interest or the principal, because right now on a balloon payment, you're only paying one or the other. That figure is callable at the end of the mortgage.
Do you have any idea what the interest rate is?
I don't know.
Okay.
So
I mean, the mortgage on your building is like 48 pages.
But one of the interesting things is there's something called the New York City Housing Development Corporation, called HDC. And HDC is what's called a public-private corporation, and they are there for the benefit of providing and maintaining affordable housing. And what HDC has done is they came up in 2004 with what's called the Mitchell-Lama refunding program. And the idea at that point was, just as Graham is saying, was that many of the Mitchell-Lama co-ops had a second balloon mortgage that was going to come due. And they were worried about that, and people were worried about it, and so they came up with a plan to, again, they're not about making a profit, they're not about being a bank or profit making, they're about keeping Mitchell-Lama nonprofit. So they came up with a plan to refinance the mortgages of Mitchell-Lama buildings, to get rid of that balloon mortgage, put the mortgages together. And they also gave in the package that they came up with, they gave repair grants for repair. So many Mitchell-Lama co-ops and some of the Mitchell-Lama rentals took advantage of this, got rid of their balloon mortgage payment, and then really came away with a really good deal to maintain the affordability of their development.
Two more follow-ups just on the HDC point is HDC's actually refinanced over 18,000 cooperative Mitchell-Lama units since the early 2000s, since it started these programs. And when you refinance with HDC, you have to pledge to stay in the program for an extended period of time. You essentially extend the affordability. So over 14,000 of those have what are known as long-term lock-ins that range from 20 to 35 years, and that really is a very, critical way to extend.
Keep us affordable.
Yeah,
and
to stay in the Mitchell-Lama
Let's take a break, and I want to run the third roll in, and we'll go to that, and we'll come right back at you. Let's give us a break here.
Once you say there's a place where everyone's life is interchangeable, everyone then must have exactly the same stuff, which sounds like these beautiful complexes. This is at New York City. Don't you want to live there? This is Co-op City. Oh, man. That is so beautiful. That's the great society for you right there, and those are the lush ones.
Over the years, cooperatives went out of fashion, dismissed as dated and socialistic. As wages stagnated for many Americans, housing became more than shelter. It became seen as an asset, the only surefire way to build wealth and achieve the American dream.
Owning a home is a part of that dream. It just is. Right here in America, if you own your own home, you're realizing the American dream.
Many labor co-ops have privatized in recent years, allowing residents to sell their units at market prices. But in 2012, a majority of Co-op City residents voted to preserve affordability for another 35 years, in exchange for a low-interest mortgage and tax incentives.
If the housing now was to be sold on the market, 99% of those families living here could not afford to move back. And the color, the composition of the community was much different. So if you take a look at it, all the houses, Mitchell-Lama houses, is the most integrated communities in our nation. If you take a look at market rent co-ops, you see that they're segregated and they're mostly white. Mostly white.
Today, Co-op City is one of the largest middle-class communities of color in the nation. At $58,000 per household, Co-op City residents earn close to New York City's median income. But while New York City's median wage earner pays over 65% of their income in rent in the private market, Co-op City's residents pay less than 20% of their income towards their cooperative housing costs.
There's a gaping hole for people who are, working in offices and, making, they may be making, $50,000 a year, $55,000 a year, but all their money is going toward the rent. The government is more concentrating on lower income families, and real estate developers are concentrating on the higher income families. So where does the people in the middle go? If everybody that was in the middle left New York City, what would happen to New York City?
When I come home, it's funny, I'm usually getting off the express bus. And I've usually just come from Manhattan, where the city that never sleeps. And when I get off the express bus, I can hear my footsteps. I can hear the birds if, they're tweeting. Sometimes I'll see a raccoon or a skunk. I hear there's deer now. I might see Bambi soon, but it's very quiet. It's very quiet. And I have a sort of, I don't want to say love-hate relationship with that, but I just enjoy coming home to Co-op City. I really do. I really do.
Bernie Silage, who you saw on the screen there, is a very active member of Cooperators United for Mitchell-Lama.
He's been there since '72.
And has been for a number of years, and a long-term resident of Co-op City. And when I was first invited up to Co-op City to do an analysis of their finances, it would was sort of like what you're describing in Esplanade Gardens. The board was divided, but seemed to be leaning towards privatization.
Okay.
The management company was, and their financial debt structure was kind of dangerous, and they were in the red. So what happened? Well, first of all, we managed to convince a majority of people that privatization was in fact a bad idea for them.
Okay.
More important, Bernie and others really got organized, and they actually tried to keep him off the board.
Right.
They tried all kinds of silly games, told him it wasn't his primary residence because he's got a cabin in the Adirondacks. They told him he violated the election law because he distributed a pamphlet, all kinds of games. But 2-3 election cycles later, Bernie's the board treasurer. The president of the board is pro-Mitchell Lama. What did they do? They fired the management company and got a new one. What else did they do? They took their very high interest private balloon loan, got rid of it, and refinanced with HUD. So they now have a 35-year, very low interest fixed rate loan. They got their cogeneration plant to work. They're back in the black and financially, and the pro-Mitchell Lama people have taken control of the board. So that's the success story
example of
how you do
answer
it.
to your question.
And the organizational challenge were real, and if anything, the situation was, well, worse. There are other stories, and it would probably be interesting if we told some of them. The Cadman Towers story is fascinating.
You know, I think it's, what's the quote from Gandhi? First they ignore you, then they fight you, then they laugh, and then you win. And so it is persistence, and I think that's the Cadman Towers story, is that our board was all privateers. They were, you know, we organized, we fought back, we educated, we newsletters.
Tell me where Cadman Towers is. You're
Cadman
downtown,
Towers
and you have a view of the river, right? Brooklyn Bridge.
Well, you know, every time we talk about Mitchell Lama, it's an embarrassment of riches, because I moved into Cadman Towers when my children were in kindergarten. I have twins, and they're now, you know, grown. And actually, my son lives at
Village East Towers.
Village East Towers with my grandchildren. And so, but my apartment, I have a 2-bedroom apartment now with a terrace that overlooks the harbor and the Statue of Liberty. That I
worth
pay.
A fortune.
Huh?
Worth a fortune.
It's worth what I. You know, a Mitchell Lama, it's not about a fortune, it's about having a place to live.
On the open market, it would be worth what?
Right, in the market it would be worth $1 million plus or whatever, I think. But you know, so I have this embarrassment of riches. And when I talk to the young people today and I say, well, my maintenance is what they're paying for a crappy room in, you know, Bed-Stuy. So,
but this is because you've been there for years.
No. And the person moving into my, if I died tomorrow and my estate sells that apartment, they would have the same deal that I have.
And the issue at hand is when you
it's non-profit. It's not about making a profit.
Right. For us in Esplanade, I think knowing how Harlem is changing, a 1-bedroom is probably about $2,100 a month on the open market.
And what is it at Esplanade?
A 1-bedroom is somewhere between $600–700, I think, a month. In maintenance, right? In maintenance. It's very difficult for our children to find decent housing that they can call their own. So a lot of times, we being at the low middle income level have not put housing in place for our children to move out. And they end up being here forever and ever because we cannot afford $2,100 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment in my community. So it's a really important component to sustain it. But when you have boards that do not even think about privatization, I mean, the operation of this board that is in Esplanade does not really, not only do they not talk to the shareholders and keep them informed as to what's going on, my question in many cases is, do they really know? Because in the case of Esplanade, most of the decision-making that goes on is done by management, and the board follows what management says they need to do. So they don't really...
And I think that's happened at other Mitchell Lamas.
Right.
You know,
So
you're not
what do we
unique in that. Well, the structure is the board controls management, and so you need to take the power back from management.
Take the power back,
you are
right.
their employer, and you need to act like their employer and
Right.
not cower or go.
And many of the residents don't even understand that. They're looking for HPD and when you talk to shareholders and they have thoughts, and I'll give you, well, I won't even say that, but when they have thoughts about what needs to be done, their only question sounds like they're operating on the mindset of living in a rental, in a NYCHA. So, well, HPD says, it's not about what HPD says, it's about what we say to both management, the board, and HPD, what we want to see done. And that mindset is almost not existing in Esplanade, and that's to take back your power. That has to occur in order for us. We live in Central Harlem. Central Harlem, to own a brownstone, you better have a couple of $1 million to just do, I mean, a shell is $500,000, and that means you still got to go back in there and do whatever. So the market and all of the new housing that is being built is really not geared towards low middle income residents as were
working people.
Working people,
people
right?
Who get a paycheck.
Right.
Paycheck
it's not geared to that at all.
Not able to get any housing anymore.
No.
And you know, you either have to be really rich. And you know, the housing model. I mean, Dick just wrote a brilliant paper on this, so you know, hopefully that will turn out another time. But the housing models post, you know, Reagan and now are that you pay 30%. It's affordable if you pay 30% of your gross income to housing. And basically, if you don't, as a single person, you would need to make $60,000 or $70,000 to have enough money left over to live in New York City. If you're going to pay 30% to, and so all of the ads that you see in the paper for so-called affordable housing are really not affordable. Our homeless population is going up astronomically, and some of the people going into homeless shelters are coming out of affordable housing.
Right.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. It's been an education, and hopefully we can continue this. And as to my public, hey. Here's some lessons learned. This is about affordable housing, and stay tuned for more of the Gilchrist Experience. So we'll be back next week for more interesting topics. Thank you. The God in me loves the God in you. Stay tuned. Power to the people. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Winston.